Australia has this incredible, rich tradition of people using music to address social and political and cultural issues. And it's, you know, going back to the days of the gold rushes when there were lots of songs written. They were anti-authoritarian protests by the miners or the outback workers. So it's a great and honourable Australian tradition to have protest songs. So going back to the 60s, like most teenagers, I was in a pretty awful garage band, and I was a very, very ordinary drummer, I have to say. And my next door neighbour took me down to, this was in Sydney at the time, my next door neighbour took me down to a folk club in Narrabeen, and I'd never been to a folk club, but the most amazing thing was that on that night there was a bush band, and when I heard the word folk, I thought of Irish groups and, you know, Pete Seeger and all those people. Anyway, these people were actually playing Australian songs and songs from the bush that I'd never heard. And I was absolutely captivated, and I thought, this is the most fantastic music, but it's stories about Australia. And I thought, wow. So I didn't do anything about it, but then a year or so later, I fell in love at a New Year's Eve party in Sydney, and next day discovered that the person I'd fallen in love with came from Perth, which was a bit inconvenient, really. But so off I went to Perth and joined this Irish group over there, and they gave me a lagerphone and a tin whistle, neither of which I'd ever played, and they said, look, can't be too hard here, they're not real instruments, off you go. And so I did that for a couple of years, and then we got one of those P&O cruise ships from Sydney, so we drove across the Nullarbor, went on the cruise ship, came back, went to drive back to Perth, and the car blew up. And so we had to have a benefit concert in Melbourne to get a new engine. And it was at Frank Trainor's Folk Club, famous for having launched the careers of the Seekers and many others. One of the bands who played at the benefit for our new engine was called the original Bushwackers and Bullockies Bush Band. Anyway, we got the new engine, drove back to Perth, and about a month later I got a phone call asking me if I wanted to join. And I just enrolled to do a dip ed teaching in Perth. And my ex-love, now my new wife, said, I will follow you anywhere provided you finish the year of teaching. And I thought, well, that's probably the end of my band aspirations. But anyway, I finished, and they rang up again and said, are you still interested? So I dragged her all the way over to Melbourne at the beginning of 1973, joined the band, and the rest is semi-history, really. When you say bush band, this is T-chest bass and lagerphone. It's all acoustic, you know, fiddle, accordion. And about 6 months after I came to Melbourne, the band decided it would go off to England, because in Europe at that time there was this huge folk revival happening. And so we sent about 300 letters to people in folk clubs in England and said, can we have a gig? And we heard back from one of them. And we thought, oh, what are we going to do? Anyway, we'd already bought the tickets, and so we had to go. So we had a farewell concert, and everybody in Melbourne went, good luck, lads. Little did they know we had no prospects at all. So off we went, and eventually got a few gigs and stuff. But the important thing was we met up with a couple of bands over there. One of them was named Fairport Convention, who just celebrated their 50th anniversary. And they had done an amazing thing, which was to electrify British folk music. So this made it accessible to a whole new generation. And we saw what the effect that that had, because up until now, all this is performed in folk clubs to basically old crusty dudes drinking lots of pints of beer and stuff. And it was the same, roughly speaking, in Melbourne. And we saw these pubs full of young people having a marvellous time. And we thought, my God, we could do that too. And so we did. So we got a drummer and a bass player and electric guitar. So it was Celtic music mixed with Australian bush tunes and bits and pieces of rock and roll, because we'd all grown up during the 60s and had those influences as well. And so we came back to Melbourne, and much to the horror of the folk community, we did a return gig at the Melbourne Town Hall and got booed off stage for daring to have electric instruments. And the sound man got hit by a chair-wielding bikie who said it was the most appalling thing he'd ever seen, and he'd travelled hundreds of miles, as it was then, to see this travesty, this electrification of folk music. Anyway, but the people in the pubs and clubs loved it. And so for the next six and a half years, we travelled back and forth to Europe about 7 or 8 times and lived in London, basically, and toured all over Europe. And then by the end of the 70s, that sort of folk boom had run out, and so we came back here and started touring nationally all the time. And then about 1985, people, wanted to have families and do all that sort of stuff, so we stopped touring all the time, because it was all the time at that stage. And people started having families and wandering off and doing other bits and pieces. But we've kept playing from that day to this with only 96 people in the band. It's only an average of a couple a year. We figure that's not bad. When we came back from England that first time, and we had basically a rock band lineup, drums and electric bass and electric guitar, but with fiddles and lagerphones and whistles and folk instruments. We were just regarded as a fairly strange sort of rock band. And so we spent the decade of, the 70s and the 80s, playing in all those wonderful pub band venues, and, we shared the bill with some, maybe they shared the bill with us. No. We shared the bill with, we played with Cold Chisel and My Sex and Midnight Oil and the Angels. And looking back on it, it was incredibly weird. But the Celtic-based music is so dance-based, and the pubs love it because it seems to induce people to consume drink. So we had a wonderful time playing with all those people. So at the time, we didn't think it was really weird that we'd be invited to do some major festivals. But on reflection, of course, you think, wow, how incredible was that? I'd love to give you my personal and in-depth analysis of playing at Sunbury, but I suspect, like most of the people who did, we don't remember very much about it. But what I do remember is, it might have been a shock for some of the people, but you see, we'd done umpteen years of touring all around the country, so playing, in outdoor venues, in showgrounds at the back of Burke and Queensland and Mount Isa and all those places. So Sunbury was just another sort of dusty paddock with a monstrous stage. So it was bigger than any of the ones we'd done, but it wasn't actually anything out of the ordinary until you see how many people were there, of course. But of course, it's a bit like Woodstock. I suspect that, you know, it's probably over 1 million by now of all the people who promised they were at Sunbury. But look, I'm sure I had a marvellous time. I first saw Margaret Knight and Jeannie Lewis and Marion Henderson and Phil Lobel and all those legends of the Aussie folk scene way back at, there used to be a thing called the Newport Folk Festival in Sydney. So that would have been the first time I saw all of those folks. And we bumped into each other over festivals ever since, basically, and we're all still alive and kicking. Well, nearly all alive and kicking. But I don't know, it must be something about the preservative functions of Guinness or something, I think, that we've all managed to embalm ourselves sufficiently. But, I mean, the folk scene and the country scene are pretty special places, and one of the reasons is that the fans are incredibly loyal. You know, we keep bumping into people who, you know, used to come to the Dan O'Connell, which was where that was our sort of stomping ground in the 70s and 80s up in Carlton in Melbourne. And we keep bumping into people all over the country at sort of, you know, festival gigs or clubs and pubs, and, you know, they come up and go, oh, we used to come to the dances that you guys did at La Trobe Uni or Sydney Town Hall. The dances were probably the thing that kept us alive financially, but because we sort of hit on this idea that people in the bush used to hold bush dances in community settings all the time, and the only times we'd played in town were basically in the pubs and clubs, and we thought, well, there's no reason why we couldn't try and replicate that community atmosphere. And so we were very ambitious, and we went out to the Royal Melbourne Showgrounds, and we found the Centenary Pavilion, which at Royal Showtime was the one which was full of all those amazing displays where they put the fruit and the produce in amazing patterns and sunrise effects. And so we had some friends who owned a restaurant, and we decided to hold bush dances out there and to provide supper. And so for about 5 or 6 years, once a month, we would get 2,000 people out there, and we would have to make supper for them all, which was a ridiculous idea. But hey, and so then we took them to Sydney and did the Sydney Town Hall and Birkenhead Point up there. But for about 10 years, they kept us alive, those very large dances, and resulted in a couple of song books and dance books and things which every poor child in primary schools throughout Australia were forced to do the heel and toe polka by teachers. But hey, we're still doing it to this day, so it's good fun. I've always been politically involved, and the Vietnam rallies and everything happened at exactly the same time as the Bushwackers were playing, and the band was formed out at La Trobe University in Melbourne, and everybody was involved, not in terms of party political, but everybody was politically motivated. And of course, a lot of the songs that were the original Bushwackers repertoire are all written from the point of view of bush workers. So they're all about anti-authoritarian attitudes and, you know, the workers standing up to the bosses, and the Ballad of 1891, which is all about the shearers' strike. So all of those things are right through the repertoire, and in the last 20 years, as we've started writing our own modern folk songs, we've continued that. So on our latest album, which is our 34th album, the first single off that is a song we wrote called Leave It in the Ground, which is all about Lock the Gate and fracking. And of course, performed in most communities around Australia. It's a considerable success with the crowd, I have to say. And there's a song called The Hungry Mile, which is all about the queues that formed on the docks in Sydney during the Great Depression. And Roger and I, being of the age we are, we decided it was time to write a tribute song to Gough Whitlam, because in terms of Australia in general, but music and the arts especially, the Whitlam government was absolutely central. And I mean, none of us would be here, I suspect, enjoying the end product of what started then, because music and the arts before the Whitlam government were regarded as minor pursuits for, you know, the ne'er-do-wells or the dilettantes or people who didn't have a real job, you know. After the folk scene dissipated during the 80s, the Bushwackers, for some weird reason, got embraced by the country music community. And so we got invited to go to Tamworth for the festival because we'd been nominated for a golden guitar. And we knew nothing about the golden guitars. We knew nothing about Tamworth. And so off we went to Tamworth in 1981, and blow me down, we won a golden guitar and thought, wow, how easy is this? And didn't win another one for the next 29 years, but that's all right. It's interesting how politicised that electorate has become, because everybody thinks about the people in rural communities as incredibly conservative. And of course, when an issue like fracking and coal seam gas, they have become incredibly active. And, you know, there are protests involving all ages, all generation. It's been fantastic and great for us too. I'm the current chairman president of the Country Music Association of Australia. And one of the things that I am happy to tell people is how completely frustrating it is that so many Australian country artists, particularly young ones, have taken a leaf out of the American country music playbook, which is you mustn't upset anybody. You mustn't say anything political, religious, you mustn't have an opinion, you must just be nice to people. And so by trying to please everybody, of course, you don't please anybody. Songs have to have a message. It has to mean something. And it doesn't have to be a political message, but songs about, you know, going out and having fun and that, just, nah. I'm just going to tell a little anecdote here. We were almost signed to EMI Records in London on our second last tour. And we were that close to signing, and we were just about to go out and celebrate when we got a phone call from the EMI people. And now this is after about 6 months of discussions and contract negotiations, and and they rang us up and said, hey, listen, sorry guys, it's all over. It ain't gonna happen. And we were absolutely devastated. And we said, why? And they said, oh, well, that thing you're doing, that music you're playing, I mean, that's okay, but it's all dead now. The whole industry's gonna change. And we went, why? What's happened? And they said, well, why don't you come out with us tonight, and we'll buy you a drink to commiserate and everything, and we love you and that. And they took us to the Hopetoun Hotel in London, and we got to see one of the very first gigs by the Sex Pistols. And it was shattering. Now, the reason I talk about them was that they started out with a political message. But, I mean, the music was hopeless, they were all out of tune, and it just didn't matter, I got it. The moment they got on stage, there was enough energy in that room to, light the whole city of London. And I went, yeah, I get it. We're gone. And so we slunk away. It didn't mean that we couldn't get any gigs, but the industry was just totally blown away by the whole thing. And I mean, I'd never seen anything like it, and I don't think probably anybody has to this day. But I mean, one of the strengths was that it was all about their attitude, their anti-authoritarian stance. I mean, some of the songs were overtly political, but the whole thing was spitting in the face of the industry and the establishment. And the whole punk thing was about that, and no wonder people were so taken by it. But I mean, I've had a lot to do with people like the great Kev Carmody and Paul Kelly and Midnight Oil, of course. But, Australia has this incredible, rich tradition of people using music to address social and political and cultural issues. And it's, going back to the days of the gold rushes, when there were lots of songs written and usually put to popular tunes of the time, but they were anti-authoritarian protests by the miners or the outback workers. So it's a great and honourable Australian tradition to have protest songs. There are some cases where songwriters tap into something that they discern is going on in the community. There's an issue that may have affected them personally. They write a song that helps highlight the issue, and then that song and those other songs help the rest of us understand because they highlighted the issue. So, I mean, music in that sense, because it has the ability not only to entrance and involve a live crowd, but because television and radio have used it so powerfully for their own purposes, of course, to raise sponsorship and advertising money, but the constant broadcast of a hit song. So Treaty in its time being played everywhere all the time can't have helped but actually build sensibilities and get people even thinking about an issue which they wouldn't have considered had it been, put in editorials in newspapers or done as a magazine story on, 7:30 Report or something. So, I mean, music, because it's so emotive and powerful, can break through and highlight issues. Now, it starts to lose its effectiveness if it tries to be too didactic and takes issues on board and be too literal, but as an evocative instrument for making communities consider things that they probably haven't before. It's a wonderful thing. And that's why we all do it. And that's why we celebrate it in somewhere like the Vault.